yes, containment of Iran as proxies, but no, they fear that war would actually be destabilizing for them in the region. I think they're right, in my own opinion. The question is whether the Israeli government, which obviously Netanyahu and his allies want to see war with Iran, in part because they believe that this is a great opportunity to completely destroy Iran's nuclear program. And they even hope that they could bring down the regime. And there are some voices in the U.S., including people around, who feel the same way. So there is an alliance of people who have that incentive. The question is, would they dare take actions of their own that would directly lead to American involvement? There's no question that the Israelis alone cannot do an attack on Iran without American support. They just cannot sustain it in a way that would bring about the desired results. Only with the U.S. can they hope to, and there's no guarantee even with that you're going to get the desired results in destroying the nuclear program. But there's absolutely no hope can even be done without American support.
Does Saudi Arabia have a track to normalize with Israel as long as Gaza remains the horrific humanitarian disaster that it's become? Because I know Donald Trump would like to see that. I'm just wondering whether this, as we've seen so many times in history, can one leapfrog over the disaster in Gaza to restart the expansion of the Abraham Accords?
Yes, I mean, there's no question that that's a big question. That's a big issue. And there are some people who believe that that's possible. I happen to think it's not likely. I base that on a lot of things, not just with the Saudis.
So when a client comes to us with an ask to launch an influencer marketing campaign, the process is pretty streamlined. So what we'll do is we'll give you the popular face platform.
For the case against Israel on prevention of humanitarian aid to.
Hello, this is DrPaulCottrell, and I'm doing a live stream tonight on YouTube. It is May 10th. I will also repost on my other channels. I have 4 channels on YouTube: Brighteon, Bitchute, and Rumble. Please subscribe to all those channels. Help support my work by sharing the links, making sure you subscribe, and click the notification bell. Ask your social media to follow me so I can create more followers and reach a larger audience to inform the public how to navigate through the financial markets, how to improve their health, especially, with some of the chronic issues that the United States has in terms of health, and learn about what's going on in the news, domestically and internationally. So please help support my work by making sure that you subscribe and share the links and ask your social media to follow me. I do all these videos for free, so if you could, please help support my work by purchasing the products that I have on my store and also donating. You can donate on my website, the-studio-reykjavik.com, through Stripe, PayPal, or Buy Me a Coffee, or be a paid member to my Patreon channel. I put everything out there for free. It is thousands of videos for free. I don't put anything behind a paywall, so please help support my work. That way it's a win-win situation. You get free content, knowledge about what's going on in the financial markets and how to improve your health and wellness, and you purchase the products and help support the content and build this community that I'm trying to build. All right, let's, one of the big things in the news, the big thing in the news is what is going on in Switzerland between the trade agreement between the United States and China. All right, if trade, something positive, tangible, something positive that's tangible that comes out of that meeting, the markets will rally on Monday. There will be confirmation before the New York Open in the Asian session tomorrow and in the European session, okay? Because they're open before the US markets. So pay attention to the Asian session if there's something tangible that comes out of that meeting. If there's nothing that's tangible, or it's a meeting that is very negative and there's no agreement, then markets are going to sell off. All right, so that's what's going to happen. Asian session, markets rally or tank. based on what transpires over the weekend in Switzerland. Very important. Also, it'll translate into the European session. And then when the New York Open happens, the futures will be either up or down for the S&P 500, depending on what is transpiring in Switzerland. Positive news, it's tangible. The markets are going to rally. Negative news, it's going to tank. All right. If it tanks, what will happen is that it'll break the 5,500 level in the S&P 500, and the support level will be at 5,150. So if it does tank, buy into the market. You'll also see that the Japanese yen will start to strengthen and move towards 142. It's been trading at about 144, 145. Now, VIX index is going to spike if the market's going to tank. And I wouldn't be surprised that VIX hits like 28, 29, maybe even 30. Now, the dollar most likely will weaken. I suspect it'll weaken. It might actually strengthen. I can argue both sides of that, but most likely it will weaken. So with that said, just pay attention to what happens with that trade agreement between the US and China. It's really important. Okay, now let's pivot over to Al Jazeera. I think they were talking about Iran, but I'm not sure if they pivoted to a different topic here.
Move public opinion dramatically against American involvement in Vietnam. I'm just wondering if you're surprised that even though we're seeing social media, TikTok, videos, tapes, etc., coming out of this region, it doesn't seem to be going anywhere but worse.
Yes, but it's not surprising. And let me tell you why it's not surprising. You can see that the American public cared deeply about Gaza, especially young people and especially Democrats. And of course, we've seen the major protests, not just on campuses, but across the United States in last year, particularly the last year.
We're going to pivot over to live now. Trump is speaking.
Why is it that these 45 other states should be?
Oh, I'm sorry. This is Friday.
The tax burden.
This was Friday.
Before.
This is a repeat.
Because
This is a repeat. That was Friday. I apologize.
there is so much that is happening with this administration every hour, not just every minute, on things that matter a lot for Americans. The economy, the tariffs, the migrants, the free speech, attacks on universities, assault on law firms, things that matter so much to Americans and obviously impacting public opinion. That Gaza recedes a bit into the background. It's not that people are not worried or not worried or concerned. In fact, our public opinion show a continued anger in our latest poll on American public opinion. What they see is happening in Gaza. More than 36% of all Americans think what's happening in Gaza is at least major war crimes. And the majority of Democrats think it's at least major war crimes. But what you see also in the polling that we've done is that a good number of Americans are self-censoring. They're self-censoring, particularly on the criticism of Israel. And now more and more people I hear are worried about protesting because they see the assault on the protests and the protesters. And it's having a chilling effect, not just on the public. I know people who normally would go protest who are now fearing that the picture is being taken and they might face some issues. Certainly that's true of campuses. We've done a lot of also polling among scholars. We find that scholars themselves, 80% of them say they self-censor even when they speak professionally on this issue. So I think there's a chilling effect that came with the Trump administration for sure, but it's not that attitudes have actually shifted. There's still tremendous sympathy with the suffering of Gazans today.
Well, let me go a step further on this very interesting poll that you did, and I should tell everyone online that the poll is available on Brookings' website. It was released on May 1st under Should We Tell Mommy, and you go to report here on it. And it's very interesting to me that you measured attitudes about Donald Trump's actions against universities and what may be behind them. And if I'm reading this correctly, you find that a majority, 57%, said confronting critics of the Trump administration was the real driver of these actions. 53% confronting critics of Israel was it. But 44% were saying that anti-Semitism, which I would call racism, etc., was it. But what's interesting to me is a few years ago, I think you would not have seen this. The question is whether the accusations of anti-Semitism are being used for other political purposes in American democracy right now. Is the subordination of universities, the subordination of speech, is that a goal that's distinct from concerns about anti-Semitism?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there's real anti-Semitism, and there's certainly rise of anti-Semitic incidents has been documented by organizations like FBI. For example, last year, just measuring anti-Semitic incidents from year to year, the FBI documented over a 50% increase, as well as an over 50% increase in Islamophobic incidents in America. So there's a problem that has to be addressed. It's not like a lack of problem. But when you ask people to put it in some perspective, aside from what you cited now in the universities, where more people think that Trump's actions against university are more motivated by confronting critics of the administration and confronting critics of Israel than it is motivated by anti-Semitism. In the general public, we have done polling about whether they think labeling people anti-Semitic.
Okay, we're going to pivot over to Fox News. The Chinese may have violated this deal to hurt Trump, according to Gordon Chang.
Double trade talk between the U.S. and China. We want to bring in the man who knows a lot more than most, Gatestone Institute senior fellow, Gordon Chang. It's always a pleasure and an honor to have you on the show today. You heard Maddie there. Gordon mentioned the president basically seems to give a little bit of leeway to his team on the ground. But I, for one, having listened to you and others, don't have high expectations that there'll be a lot of movement this weekend. Or is that sort of short-sighted? What do you think?
I agree with you. And the reason is, President Trump wants China to open up its economy. And the Treasury Secretary said that last week. But we got to remember that China runs a closed economy because Xi Jinping is preparing to go to war. And in general, he does not believe that China's consumers should have much say in the way the economy goes. He believes in a state-dominated economy, which is based on manufacturing and exports. So, we've talked to China for decades about this. And last year in the Biden administration, the discussions were intensive in Beijing, but we didn't get anywhere. As a matter of fact, consumption, which most economies are based on consumption, consumption in China is actually going down. It is about 38 to 39% of gross domestic product. That is either the lowest or among the lowest in the world. And the situation is getting worse.
It's getting worse also when you consider, frankly, this recalcitrance among the leadership in China, Gordon. I think it goes without saying, this sort of production-based economy has never, frankly, been fair for most of the people that have been trying to compete and gain entry into that marketplace. And now when you have people in that country who are, frankly, not buying, many of them, Gordon, are not even being paid right now. I noticed them protesting. Are you noticing that too, as you observe what's happening there?
Yeah, there are worker protests across the country. And in the last several days, we've been hearing reports of protests at banks. And that's because a lot of the small loans in China, the personal loans and the loans to small manufacturers, have gone bust. And that means I think there's pressure on the smaller financial institutions, which means they are restricting withdrawals and depositors are getting angry. But the worker protests have now been going on for several months, and they do span the country. And the reason is that the country's entire export sector has been hurt. And it's been hurt well before President Trump put on his Liberation Day tariffs. So this is a long-standing structural problem in China that the Chinese government just is not willing to tackle.
You know, the president actually.
This is why I was saying. This is why I was saying in multiple videos last week, where China is not economically strong in these negotiations, and that with Trump pushing for this better trade deal for the United States, bring down the trade barriers in China so the United States can sell goods in China, turn the Chinese economy into a consumption economy instead of just a producing economy, and allow for freer trade, also addressing IP issues. Intellectual property is a major problem between the United States and China. So there's lots of things that can be discussed during these trade agreements, especially the barriers of entry into the Chinese market. But China's economy is suffering. Even before the tariffs, it was faltering, and that their central bank had to intervene, and fiscal policies had to be enacted to drum up domestic spending. But domestic spending isn't happening, so the transmission mechanism from their central bank and their fiscal policy isn't translating into higher GDP, because their whole economy was an export economy, not a consuming economy like ours in the United States. So because of a command and control mechanism of the CCP, the Communist Party is a command and control type government, that they really don't have a free market. They have a quasi-free market. And there's cracks now in the system. Now, on top of it, not only do you have the lack of transmission between the central bank and the actual economy in China, but you also have people being upset about their plight economically, and the CCP, with their command and control of the economy, can't fix it. Because the invisible hand, in a strange way, there's an emergent property that has feedback loops that allows an economy to flourish. The more you intervene, the harder that emergent property to take hold. So in a command and control economy, that emergent property is suppressed. And that's what's happening in China. The people are upset, and so they're being upset with the party, and they're upset with President Xi. On top of that, President Xi is having infighting within the CCP. There are different groups. So President Xi doesn't have full control of the CCP. And he's aging, all right? I mean, he still has years left, but he's not as healthy as he once was. And he doesn't have the same control that he has within the party. So you have an economy that's faltering. You have Trump putting on these tariffs that accelerates the faltering. They don't have a transmission mechanism with the central bank and its fiscal policy that's really working very well and translating into domestic spending. And there's the infighting within the CCP. Big problems. Now the question is, will President Xi take the opportunity to try to galvanize the nation and go after Taiwan? Because usually when you go into a war situation, there's the nation galvanizes with the leader, right? They galvanize with the leader. And that may be a way where he shores up support. It's very possible. So this is not just a trade war. This is a potential hot war in the Pacific. And I think people really need to really consider this Now, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, did a white paper a long time ago, and they stated within 2025 to 2027, they wanted to have full control of Taiwan. Now, the US military at Annapolis, it's the Naval Academy, the naval think tank, all right, they think that it's going to be in 2027, not 2025. So it was extended out 2 years. So we'll see what happens. But President Xi is not in control of the economy like he thought he was. And he's not in control fully with the CCP. There's infighting. On top of this anger that's starting to happen with the population because they're losing their jobs and they're having bank runs. It's a big problem. And what Gordon Chang is talking about here is really important to understand. That the Chinese, I don't think the Chinese are as strong as people think they are. Just like the Russians weren't as strong as in terms of military as we thought they were pre-Ukraine invasion. And I think also North Korea is not as strong. I think all three of those countries are paper tigers. Except China and Russia are serious nuclear superpowers.
I'm gonna play a little bit of sound, get your reaction. Basically, the bottom line here, Gordon, is if we don't have full access to their marketplace, this is simply not a sustainable relationship. Here's the president.
We'd like to see China opened up so we can compete in China and, give people something that they've never had, access to something. That'd be great for the world. It would be great for our businesses.
Play devil's advocate for me, though. As you look at the administration's attempt to try to push something new, I'm just imagining this may take quite a long time here, Gordon.
Yeah, it could take a very long time. And it could basically take until the end of communism in China, because the problems that President Trump and others have identified are inherent in the Chinese political system.
Right.
If I can play devil's advocate, I could say, for instance, that the Chinese economy is already contracting. We see this from price data from February, March, and April. And that suggests that the Chinese technocrats might start to panic and put pressure on Xi Jinping to do something that he does not want to do. So that's always possible, but it's going to be a long slug for everybody.
Let me get your perspective while we have you, Gordon, on steps forward. If you were advising the president, for example, I listened to many of the lawmakers and newsmakers, frankly, who study China, and they say this regime consistently violates agreements that they make. If you were talking directly to the president or to his team, what do you tell them about that, even as they attempt to make a deal?
I would remind the president that China's chief negotiator in Geneva is Vice Premier He Lifeng, who, by the way, was the chief negotiator for President Trump's Phase 1 trade deal of January 2020. That was a deal which was very easy for China to comply with. All they had to do was buy more farm products and some goods, and they failed to do even that. And I would remind President Trump that that might have been a factor in that unsuccessful campaign for re-election that year. I think the Chinese actually violated that deal to hurt President Trump's re-election campaign. So I would remind the president of that.
This is such an important conversation for our country to be having right now, because if we're going to move forward and not just bring back manufacturing to this country, but more importantly, have sustainable trade, not one-sided trade, which has been, despite this argument that people have made on Wall Street, go back to status quo. It seemed to me, Gordon, as we wrap up here, status quo simply wasn't working the way, other than a few folks who are obviously cashing in, was intended. When we talk about trade with a country like China, we're talking about reciprocity, not one-sided trade here.
Yeah, and we go through the Rust Belt, Detroit and Michigan, or you go through the South, you see so many communities that have been devastated by the loss of factories to China. And then you, with the loss of hope and with all of the despair, there's fentanyl, and that is killing Americans. So this is not only an obligation we have to our fellow Americans, it is a moral obligation.
You're always welcome anytime you have a moment. Very best to your beautiful wife and your family. Gordon,
all right, we're going to pivot over to live now, talking about India and Pakistan.
Point that the word has gone up and throughout the lines on both sides. The ceasefire is in effect. And we're going to always be watching very closely to make sure this happens. But I have to tell you, this weekend, it was, or this week, I should say, yesterday and into this weekend, it was ramping up really fast. They were firing on not just terrorist targets or having a terrorist attack as happened in the Indian-controlled Kashmir area that kicked this whole thing off. But what happened was you had reports of both sides targeting and firing on military installations, military bases. That gets everybody nervous. And then late yesterday, there was reports that at least one, if not both, of the standing committee, the committees that overview what would be called their strategic weapons, their nuclear stockpiles or nuclear weapons, had been in meetings that were a little vague, but it sounded like they were preparing for maybe possible employment. And there was the White House basically said that there was something, they got a report that they felt was so compelling, they had to jump in, they had to get both sides to de-escalate quickly. I don't know for sure, but based on everything I'm seeing, the most likely cause of that was that they saw that both sides were doing things to ready their nuclear weapons inventories for possible employment. Of course, that is truly the sum of all fears if that happens, because that doesn't just affect India and Pakistan, that affects the whole world. Right. If there was a nuclear war between those two countries.
Explain that. Explain how nuclear.
I'm gonna interject and just give you my take on it. I am concerned because when you look at this Kashmir area, you have Pakistan controlling parts of it, you have India controlling parts of it, and you have also China controlling parts of it. It seems to me that it can be a flash pan, that if really intense conflict takes hold there, that the world can get involved very fast. All right. So not only can the flash pan be in Taiwan, all right, and it would launch a whole slew of military operations with the United States, with South Korea, with Japan, with New Zealand and Australia and the Philippines. But if there's major conflict, not just, border dispute kind of stuff, but serious military conflict in Kashmir, and China starts to get involved, then the United States is going to start to heavily support India. And it also the United States also has a very negative connotation to anything that it has some sort of Islamic, Islamic terrorism kind of component to it. The United States is very reactive to that. And Pakistan has serious problems with Islamic terrorism. All right. Unfortunately, the United States kind of allowed it to fester. And I don't understand why we did allow it to fester. But because of the nuclear component between India and Pakistan, and China being also controlling some of Kashmir that most people don't talk about, this could be a flashpan for major world conflict.
Of any type not only impacts the immediate region where we see some sort of nuclear activity. How does that become a global issue? Put that into your own words, please.
Well, each side has about 170 to 180 nuclear warheads that we know about. All right. India is slightly ahead. They have about 180, maybe. And Pakistan had 170. Used to be Pakistan was way ahead of India. It was kind of strange. India had kind of taken the point that, look, we have more than enough to do what we got to do. But then they decided some years back that they needed to have more nuclear weapons than Pakistan. That didn't result in a big arms race like we consider, but let's just say they have a lot of capabilities. They have some very advanced missile systems. They have aircraft that can deliver these missiles. And in the case of India, they have nuclear ballistic missile submarines. Just like we have ballistic missile submarines, they have submarines that can launch ballistic missiles. Now, for Pakistan, what that means is even if they were to launch and hit all the ground base, hit the air bases that can carry nuclear weapons, hit the missile sites themselves that they knew about, they could attack them. There's still these submarines out there that could retaliate. Each one of those submarines has enough ballistic missiles to basically destroy Pakistan as a nation state. So the fear is that if you get these 350 nuclear warheads going back and forth, each being at least an average, maybe about 40 kilotons, which is about 3 times the size of what hit Hiroshima during World War II. A huge explosion. And I don't know that they're all airburst. Some could be ground burst. That's important when you talk about the amount of stuff that can be kicked up. Ground burst tends to kick up a lot of stuff from the ground that's irradiated into the upper atmosphere. You end up with the direct effect, which if you look between the two countries, you're probably talking not tens of millions, but potentially hundreds of millions that are killed very quickly, if not immediately. Just, this is pretty gruesome stuff, but not immediately killed by the blast wave or incinerated or whatever, that they would die shortly thereafter from radiation and everything else surrounding what would take place. You're probably talking hundreds of millions between those two countries. And then you have the longer term effects from radiation, the breakdown of society, supply chains, everything else. So you're probably talking, over time, that will get over at least 1 billion just in South Asia. But then you have the upper atmospheric, the stratosphere issues, all that soot, all that smoke, all that debris, and all that radioactive material going up into the far upper atmosphere, into the stratosphere, and then traveling around the world, causing what scientists call a nuclear winter, which is it actually starts dropping the temperature of the planet by a few degrees or more than a few degrees, causing crop failures, agricultural failures around the world, not to mention all the supply chain issues, moving food and everything else around the world that will take place from this. And now you're talking the potentiality of billions of people dying all over the planet.
Yeah.
I would mention that when you talk about the radiation, this radiation event would be far in excess of anything we've ever seen before. Back in the 50s, early 60s, late 40s, the US and the Soviet Union and China would do what we call above ground testing of nuclear warheads, nuclear weapons. Las Vegas was famous that they just north of Las Vegas, they had the big nuclear test site out there. And people would go to Las Vegas, they gamble, they drink, and then they go up there and watch them explode a nuclear bomb up north. That was kind of an odd thing to do for tourism purposes. But anyway, you get the idea. But the problem was they realized it was kicking up so much radioactive fallout that wasn't just in that area, but was literally going to the upper atmosphere and getting in things like the food supply. Milk was a big issue, that it would, cattle would eat grass that had been irradiated. It would go into milk. The milk was going to babies that have far less, and children that have far less, resistance to this radioactive or to radiation because of size and a lot of other things. Anyway, long story short, we all agreed in the early 60s, at the height of the Cold War, we have to stop doing this. Imagine that happening, on, several folds beyond what those limited nuclear above ground tests are. Then you get an idea of just how serious this thing is. And that's why
this reminds me of this mythical story of gods battling each other in the sky, part of folklore in India. Right? I think this is in Hindu folklore. And it's called the celestial armor of Arjuna. So where they're battling each other, and there's, you know, it seems as though these gods use nuclear weapons against each other. What if the story has it's not a myth, but it actually happened? Or let's say it happened a long time ago, you know, like an ancient history. You know, maybe mankind is a lot older than we think. Maybe our history is a lot older. For example, in Egypt, they're starting to discover that the history of Egypt is probably much older than what the scholars are saying it is, or what the particular dogma of the age of Egypt. Maybe it's 3 or 4 times older. What if that story is true? That there was some sort of nuclear, that there were humans that had technology that the average individual may seem as though they're, you know, from a different era, would think that they were like godly. You know, if someone that's from a cave looks at how we live today, they would think that we were like gods, right? You know, with our cars and highways and big buildings and stuff, right? So maybe when the story morphed, the folklore morphed into gods battling each other, but maybe it was a real story using real nuclear weapons, all right? Or what it could be is that you have people that can meditate and actually see the future. And when it's passed down, it's not passed down in the sense that it was the past, or that it was it's not passed down as it's the future. It's assumed by the people from one generation to another, passing it down orally, that it was from the past, even though the story that was originally conveyed was of the future. All right. So is it a future event? This mythical story in India? I think it's called the celestial armor of Arjuna. Is that a future event, a past event, or both? It's possible it's both. Maybe we're in a loop. Maybe we're in a historical loop. Who knows? But I got this really weird feeling about this. All right. Now, there were some politicians talking on a channel that I saw on Friday, where I think it may have been a European, maybe Middle Eastern channel, talking between 2 representatives, one from Pakistan and another one from India. The Indians have the stance, at least on Friday, that they want to root out all terrorism out of Kashmir. That is going to be a Herculean task for India that will lead to further conflict. Now, the question is, will it lead to nuclear conflict? I don't know. But this has the rhyme. This has some sort of thematic rhyme of this, the celestial armor of Arjuna. It's really weird, right? But even if you didn't know the folklore, that area, if it goes nuclear, it's going to cause huge problems in the world.
Critical to de-escalate this as quickly as possible.
So there are 9 countries that possess nuclear weapons. Pakistan and India are 2 of them. One of the most common questions I get from viewers is this exact thing that we're talking about right now. And that's why we are talking about this grim subject. It is a grim question, but it's something that's on a lot of people's minds. What is preventing
nuclear conflict here, Hal. Presumably the destruction caused by using nukes is enough to dissuade their use. Do Pakistan and India share that common understanding?
No, they do, but they don't have, they've had nuclear weapons since the 70s. They don't have, or at least we don't feel that they have. I think India kind of does. It's never been quite clear if Pakistan had as robust, mature checks and balances on using its nuclear arsenal. India, I think, is much further along. Although both of these governments are responsive to their respective voters and populations, and right now there's a lot of emotions running very high throughout the body politics of both Pakistan and India. With India, what happened with Kashmir, with that horrific terrorist attack, and of course with Pakistan, the fact that India has attacked Pakistani territory in retaliation for that. So there's a lot of heightened tension, a lot of emotions running very strong with this. The fear is that that fervor will overtake, what we hope would be the cool heads, if you will, that are in charge of this horrific nuclear stockpile. And it basically what stops any country from doing this is what's called mutually assured destruction. If a nuclear armed country attacks another nuclear armed country, that other nuclear armed country will retaliate and destroy that country at the same time the other country is trying to destroy the other country. This was the balance of power between the U.S. and the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
This is the problem. That's assuming that you have rational actors in the MAD construct. When you don't have rational actors, MAD breaks down.
Mutually assured destruction. That template certainly applies to both Pakistan and India. They don't have some massive defense system that would assure that they would intercept all these nuclear missiles. Even now, Israel is reported, they've never publicly admitted they have nuclear weapons, although everyone's known they've had nuclear weapons going back to the 60s. But they could, the concern was in previous wars, I believe the thought was in the 73 war, the Yom Kippur, that they may have been thinking about using nuclear weapons or readying their weapons in case they were overrun or something like that. That would have been a little bit different because none of their neighbors have nuclear weapons. But certainly when you talk about the other countries of the world that have nuclear weapons, their neighbors do. Now, the U.S. provides a nuclear umbrella for South Korea. North Korea has nuclear weapons. South Korea does not. Although both South Korea and Japan, there's been a lot of discussion that both those countries may change their minds at some point, decide they need to have nuclear weapons to counter the threat as well.
So let's get to another big question. Again, I've been talking with people about this all week, and still, one of the most common questions I get is what viewer Rich sent in from Birmingham. What are they fighting about, Hal? Remind everyone, what's the catalyst that started this most recent round of conflict between the two? There's a lot of history here, but what's about the most recent terrorist attack?
Well, I think, Austin, you and I should immediately go back to the 1740s, and I'm just kidding, I'm not going to do that. But what I am saying is, if this one really gets into the essence of what is Pakistan, what is India, both those countries and Bangladesh were originally under what's called the British Raj, the rule of Britain over that entire area. All right, and the British Raj was big, went beyond that down to Burma, Myanmar as it's called now. So the British were this massive empire. In 1947, after World War II, when India became a separate country, they basically broke into two countries. One was Pakistan and one was India, and that was based on religion. Pakistan is primarily Muslim. Bangladesh originally was East Pakistan. It was part of the same country. However, in the 70s, it had a separate war and it became a separate country called Bangladesh. But it was all based on religion. And Hindu is a predominant religion in what's India. And then you get to Kashmir. Kashmir province, or Kashmir region, if you will, and Jammu is right next to it. That area, certainly Kashmir, was about 70% Muslim. However, it was ruled by a Maharaja who was Hindu. The Maharaja had absolutely no interest in his region joining this thing called Pakistan. So he always refused to join Pakistan. He affiliated with India, and that is where this thing all started. And I would point out, as much as everyone focuses on religion, and religion is a driving force.
This is where he's missing. Maybe he'll say it, but he's missing a key point here. He's talking about the British involvement going all the way back to 1947. The problem is that the Muslims and the Hindus have been battling each other for centuries. All right, the Hindus and the Muslims aren't copacetic. That's a problem. All right, so there is a religious component to it that you add in the Islamic terrorism that's taking place in Kashmir, and it's a powder keg. All right, you have territorial dispute between Pakistan and India because of the history of 1947. But it goes way beyond that. This is a battle between civilizations, between Muslim civilization and a Hindu civilization.
This is that Kashmir, Jammu area, particularly Kashmir, that sits there right on the Himalayas. That is the source of water. Big source of water for India, but the source of water, the main source of water for Pakistan. If Pakistan does not have the water that goes into the Indus River and two tributaries that come from that region, they cease to be a functional nation state. 80% of the agriculture in Pakistan comes from that water. That water is under a treaty that was signed by both countries in 1960 called the Indus Water Treaty. India guaranteed that Pakistan would have access to that water. Despite multiple wars since 1960, they have never broached that treaty until this thing happened. And India said, we are not going to abide by the Indus Water Treaty. All of a sudden, Pakistan is looking at something that would pretty much destroy Pakistan as a functional nation state. So it's not just religion, it's also water. And when India did that, they really ratcheted up the potential stakes in what's going on here.
So one more viewer question we're getting in from Lance, stateside here. How will a war affect the United States? That's another big piece.
Radioactive.
It's going to be radioactive. I will discuss the U.S. angle of this in a moment. We'll be right back.
Or immediately pulled back or ratcheted back in order to prevent this from happening. So the U.S. is now very much involved, but we are the indispensable nation in this. You know, what other country could talk to both parties like the U.S.? There really isn't one. You know, India has a simmering confrontation with the Himalaya border area with China, and a lot of strategic competition with China, so China can't step in. Russia can't do anything. The European countries, maybe Great Britain, possibly, but none of those countries have the gravitas. Certainly, none of those countries have the nuclear inventory, if you will, and the experience with nuclear weapons that the United States has. And they don't have the positioning with both countries in order to play that big intermediary role. So the U.S. is somewhat indispensable in this, and I'm really glad to see that we've stepped up. And hopefully, after the initial confusion as to whether there actually was a ceasefire in effect, hopefully there will be a ceasefire, and this will give both parties a chance to do what they've done in the past, which is they just de-escalate, they ratchet down. And prior to this big terrorist attack in Kashmir, both of these countries had actually made some major steps towards basically having more peaceful relations, more trade relations, everything else, people moving across the border back and forth. There was a lot of hope that maybe this era of Pakistan-India confrontation was over, and then this thing happened, and now we are where we are.
So another question coming in. This is another good one. This is Mary in Oklahoma saying, when there are two UN members in conflict, both with nuclear capabilities, which one does the UN stand with? You know, when I hear this question now, I think of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is loosely within the United Nations system. You know, do they stand with one side or the other, or is this just they look at this and they just say, you know what, let's de-escalate this? So what's top of mind for the UN and for the International Atomic Energy Agency when they look at the situation unfolding in the region right now?
That's a great question, and frankly, the United Nations historically has not stood with one or the other to any great degree. There have, of course, the big one was, which kind of, overlapped a huge chunk of the UN's history to include its formation, was the Cold War, and that was where two nuclear-armed countries, the Soviet Union and the United States, were confronting each other, and the UN headquarters was in New York. But the UN would basically, if you found a consensus there, it would basically be that both sides need to avoid a nuclear war. That would be the UN consensus. But keep in mind, at that point, you also had veto power on the Security Council, with Russia being a member and the US being a member. In this case, you have, I don't know at this particular point in time in the rotation of members whether India or Pakistan have membership in the Security Council. But I think if you found anything out of the UN, it would be a consensus that both nuclear powers need to de-escalate this thing and to avoid anything that could possibly lead to a potential nuclear confrontation. And so that would be where the UN would stand, generally speaking. And of course, they look at this as the impact it would have not on just those two countries, but all the countries surrounding those countries and the world as a whole in terms of what could potentially happen. So the UN would be potentially stepping in to help with the crisis, although the UN isn't the most directive body, if you will. They're not like a nation state. They're a collection of all these countries. Some have called it the Great Global Debate Society, if you will. So there are limits to what they can do, but the IAEA, as you mentioned, plays a huge role when there is something where they want to monitor the nuclear inventories of one nation or another, that they can step in and do inspections and a lot of other things.
And I will say that as far as the Security Council goes, it looks like Pakistan is a member of the Security Council until 2026, so they're in the rotation right now.
Yeah, although I would mention they do not have veto authority. They're in there, but there's only 5 countries that have veto authority.
Right. So another question coming in, this one from Tim in Seattle. Hi, crew. Do you think we will see a long-term deal after the ceasefire, or will it be more of a North Korea and South Korea situation? Obviously, nobody has a crystal ball here, Hal. But is there any indication that there could be some sort of long-term conflict going on, right? I mean, there already kind of has been, but are there any parallels to draw between what's happening in North and South Korea and what we're seeing in India and Pakistan?
Well, 2 things. Number one, neither of these countries are what I would call the hermit kingdom situation you have in North Korea, where they basically have these closed borders. And I don't perceive them trying to build a DMZ-style border going all the way down from the Himalayas all the way down to the Indian Ocean, blocking off Pakistan. I see them, they're going to be defending the border. They may make some improvements, but we're not seeing that.
Right. I want to go to France now, live. They're talking about India and Pakistan. Someone's speaking, an official.
With seriousness and responsibility.
Pakistan said it remained committed to the truce.
We have acted as a responsible state for the world and regional peace and stability, and for the lives of millions of people in the region who gave a positive response to the ceasefire suggestion.
The violations tempered the enthusiasm of those on both sides of the border who earlier had taken to the streets to celebrate the news. In Mumbai, students had even painted artwork of Prime Minister Narendra Modi alongside the US president. after Donald Trump first announced Saturday that a complete and immediate ceasefire would come into effect following a night of US-led negotiations.
Congratulations to both countries on using common sense and great intelligence.
Pakistan's foreign minister had confirmed the deal, saying 36 countries were involved in the mediations, including Saudi Arabia and Turkey. He celebrated on social media, adding that Pakistan has always strived for peace and security in the region, without compromising on its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Minutes later, India confirmed that both militaries had agreed to halt fighting. If sustained, the ceasefire would bring an end to the biggest military conflict between the two nuclear-armed states in decades. Until then, civilians will be waiting with bated breath.
France 24's Navadita Kumari is in Jammu in India-administered Kashmir, where residents have been living in fear. She sent us this report.
Look at this. This is my shop. It was attacked and is still burning. Our houses and shops have been hit. Look at the situation around here.
In the border district of Uri, the village of Langama was hit by artillery shells from across the border in Pakistan, only a few kilometers away.
I'm going to go pivot back to live now.
Come to some sort of longer truce, and then maybe that will lead to a larger agreement between the two countries. Who knows? You could also see potentially, we've seen this happen before, there could be some element of denuclearization. You know, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union eventually reached a point in the 70s where we started having discussions, you know, the SALT discussions, the START discussions, where we actually started limiting the number of nuclear arms. That's potentially something that could happen in South Asia.
The world's militaries, by the way, Hal, they've been learning from these so-called aerial dogfights between the two, correct?
Oh, absolutely. One of the things that the Pakistanis have is they have the J-10C Chinese fighters, which is one of the most advanced fighters that China has, and also the PL-15 air-to-air missiles. Both of these appear to have been very successful in the initial fighting. There is a report that I have not heard put aside, it's still out there, that the first night when the actual combat between Pakistan and India kicked off, the retaliation by India for the attack that happened in Kashmir, that there was 125 aircraft in air-to-air combat. We haven't seen anything like that since World War II. It is a phenomenal amount of aircraft. And with that, we're seeing not just the fighters themselves. You know, you had the most advanced French fighters out there. You had some older Soviet fighters that were out there. You know, the MiG-29, India was flying that along with the Su-30. But also they had the Rafale French fighters that were out there. But it sounds like these Chinese aircraft and these Chinese missiles were very effective. And everybody's paying attention to this because China hasn't been at war since really 1979. And so we're getting a chance to see, okay, they've done this huge increase in weapons. They've been improving the technology. How do they actually work under real world combat conditions? And we've got a first chance to see what that's like. And you can bet that's going to be incorporated in the planning, thinking, assessments of militaries around the world, not the least of which is the U.S. military.
Al is the host of the Strap Podcast. What's coming up on the Strap Podcast, Al?
Well, thank you for asking. We're going to be talking about, obviously, the Pakistan-India conflict, what it could lead to, what are the potential implications of that. Also going to talk, which I think is kind of a strategic inflection point, just prior to us going on, which is that what's happening in Kyiv. And what's interesting is you saw 4 European countries there, you know, Britain, France, Germany, Poland, all sitting there with President Zelensky, and they all got on the phone and called President Trump in Washington, D.C. before 7 a.m., all right, to say, hey, look, are you with, you know, this is what we've all decided, and the president agreed with them. I find this interesting, a couple things. Number one, it's a real shift in the U.S. position, but also the other thing is, you're seeing almost a passing of the baton. Under the Biden administration, it was the U.S. pulling all these European countries to be more supportive, more assertive, to to lean forward in this thing. And with Germany, it was very much getting Germany to basically move in this direction, which took a lot of coaxing. Now all of a sudden you see it going the other way. European countries have almost, one could say, picked up the baton, and they're running with it. And now they're going back and asking the U.S. to maintain support or to join them in things that they're leading on. I just find that to be a fascinating shift, and I'm going to be spending some time talking about that.
Al, you've been very generous with your time today. We've gone long. This was a topic that deserved it, though, and I appreciate you taking the time just to discuss it all with us.
All right, so we're going to pivot over to the trade agreement between China and the United States. So as of right now, it looks like there is a ceasefire, but will it hold between Pakistan and India? Who knows? Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Get the structural nanosilver toothpaste. This will whiten your teeth, freshen your breath, help with your gum health, reduce inflammation. It's a very high quality toothpaste made from structural nanosilver gel or structural nanosilver. So another great product that I have is olive leaf extract. It's a dual purpose product. It helps with your cardiovascular health and your immune system. It brings down inflammation and helps your lipid profile. It'll help to bring down LDL levels and increase your HDL levels. And another product that I have that I really think that you really need to get, hint, hint, is the structural nanosilver lozenges and drops. We're in the allergy season. Some people even have problems when they are doing lawn care or whatever. But the issue here is you want to mitigate the problem right away. If you start to have an irritation in your throat, you need to take the lozenges and the drops right away. I have structural nanosilver drops and lozenges. I have in stock the elderberry and zinc. You get 21 in each bag. And I also have the drops in 3 different varieties. Blueberry, cherry flavor, and also in honey and lemon. So get a few bags for your household. Make sure you have some at work and at home. You never know when you need it. Right when you have that irritation in your throat, either because of the cold season, the allergy season, or even if you live in an area or work in an area where the air quality is poor. Use these to mitigate any irritation that you may start experiencing. Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Get the structural nanosilver lozenges, the structural nanosilver toothpaste, and the olive leaf extract. All right, with that, I want to start talking about the trade agreement here.
The US and China kicked off high-level trade negotiations in Switzerland on Saturday. It's a tentative first step towards diffusing a trade war between the world's 2 largest economies that has disrupted global markets. Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng resumed talks with US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent in Geneva after weeks of growing tensions. The trade dispute, combined with the US President Donald Trump's decision last month to impose duties on dozens of other countries, has disrupted supply chains, unsettled financial markets, and stoked fears of a sharp global downturn. Earlier this week, President Trump suggested that an 80% tariff on Chinese goods seems right. That suggested for the first time a specific alternative to the 145% levies that he has imposed on Chinese imports.
We're going to see right now, you can't get any higher. It's at 145, so we know it's coming down.
Washington is seeking to reduce its trade deficit with Beijing and convince China to renounce what the US says is a mercantilist economic model and contribute more to global consumption. Beijing has pushed back against what it sees as external interference. It has also retaliated with 125% tariffs and said it would not bow down to imperialists and bullies. It wants Washington to lower tariffs, clarify what it wants China to buy more of, and treat it as an equal on the world stage. But with the distrust running high, both sides have been keen not to appear weak, and economic analysts have low expectations of a breakthrough. While Trump has suggested the discussions were initiated by China, Beijing said the US requested them, and that China's policy of opposing US tariffs had not changed. China could be looking for the same 90-day waiver on tariffs that Washington has given other countries. Any kind of tariff reduction and follow-up talks would be seen as positive by
All right, let's try this one.
Well, this morning, the world's two largest economies began holding high-stakes tariff talks. Meanwhile, the Fed left interest rates unchanged this week and warned of rising economic uncertainty. On Thursday, President Trump announced his first trade deal with the UK, but getting China, one of America's top suppliers of goods, to budge, well, that will be a huge undertaking. Willie James Inman is at the White House. Good morning, Willie James.
Good morning to you, Michelle. A high-level in-person conversation between the U.S. and China kicks off this weekend in Switzerland as both economic superpowers engage in a trade war. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer are in Switzerland over the weekend to strike a potential trade deal with Chinese officials.
So I think we're going to come back with a fair deal for both China and us.
Most imported Chinese goods are subject to a 145% tariff. But on Friday, the president floated lowering the rate to 80%.
The president still remains with his position that he is not going to unilaterally bring down tariffs on China. We need to see concessions from them as well. As for the 80% number, that was a number the president threw out there.
The White House says the frameworks of a deal with the United Kingdom announced earlier this week could serve as a template for negotiating hundreds of other deals with nations around the world.
So I think that as we move forward and remove, hopefully, uncertainty on China, and get deals like the UK, then people understand what President Trump's trade policy has been all about.
An agreement with China remains a top priority for the Trump administration, amid concerns that a standoff with China will lead to higher costs and a possible economic downturn. Jonathan Aronson is an expert on international trade.
So we pushed the tariffs well over 100% in both directions. That's not sustainable. The president, the secretary of treasury, the U.S. trade representative, and the Chinese representatives know that. So they want to get it back down, and this is a start, not an end.
The White House says deals with other nations are on the horizon, but it's unclear which nations will be announced next. Dana?
All right, Willie, thank you very much.
I think it's going to be Japan.
Hello.
All right.
My name is Adam Ferrari.
All right. Hopefully this one has audio.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and China's Vice Premier. He Liping held talks early on Saturday, May 10th, in Geneva. China's state-owned news agency Xinhua reported. Their meeting comes weeks after escalating tensions that led to tariffs on goods imports between the world's two largest economies, soaring well beyond 100%. Prospects for a major breakthrough appear dim, but there is hope that the two countries will scale back the massive tariffs they've slapped on each other's goods. This in turn threatened world financial markets and companies on both sides of the Pacific Ocean that depend on U.S.-China trade.
This is just the first of many trade deals to come. Get ready for more historic deals in our country to boom like never before.
The head of crucial trade
Like I
talks,
said,
US
for the ones that are just signing on and watching, like I said, if the trade agreement is positive, there's something tangible that comes out of it this weekend. Markets will rally, Bitcoin will rally, the VIX index will go down, and the Japanese yen is going to weaken. But if nothing comes out of this, nothing tangible, markets are going to sell off. The VIX index is going to go up, and the Japanese yen is going to strengthen. And I suspect that also the oil will go down too. Now, it's very important that the longshoremen have already mentioned that containers that are coming in from Asia are empty, or a lot less are flowing on the docks. So goods we're already starting to see the actual shipment of goods landing on the shores of the West Coast in California are less. So the longer this continues, the less goods will be available in stores in the United States.
Donald Trump signaled on May 9th that he might reduce tariffs on China to 80%, down from the current 145% rate. This comes ahead of key U.S.-China trade talks scheduled this weekend in Switzerland. In a Truth Social post, Trump stated, quote unquote, 80% tariff on China seems right, up to Scott Bessent. He was referring to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who is expected to lead the U.S. representatives in talks with his Chinese counterparts during the Swiss meeting. Trump later posted, many trade deals in the hopper, all good, great ones, signaling wider trade efforts. Notably, an 80% tariff is still steep, but a clear shift from Trump's hardline stance just days ago. It also remains far higher than the 10% base tariff used in the new U.S.-UK trade deal announced on May 8th. However, it's unclear whether Trump sees 80% as a long-term rate or simply a step toward a final agreement. In another Truth Social post, Trump urged China to open up its market to the U.S., stating that it would be beneficial for them, adding that closed markets no longer work. Remember, China remains Trump's biggest target as he tries to reset U.S. trade policy heading into 2025. Other U.S. allies got temporary tariff relief in April, but China faced escalating penalties. Now, both the U.S. and China have tariffs over 100% on many goods, deepening economic tensions. China is one of America's largest trading partners, with over $580 billion in goods exchanged in 2024. The latest shipping data shows a drastic decline in the amount of goods moving from China to the U.S., leading to concerns about the potential for higher prices or even shortages of certain goods in the coming weeks.
All of this happened because of President Trump's implementation of powerful tariffs to end the era of economic surrender and rebalance America's trading agreements. American workers and companies are the best in the world, and they finally have a president who has their backs, fights for them, and delivers good deals that puts them first. This is just the first of many trade deals to come. Get ready for more historic deals in our country to boom like never before. On that note, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Ambassador Jameson Greer will meet with the lead representatives on economic matters from the People's Republic of China over the weekend in Switzerland. As President Trump has said, the United States and China have been talking for some time over the course of the administration, and now teams from both countries will meet in person to continue discussions. You can be certain that President Trump and his trade team will ensure we work to achieve the best deal possible for America.
U.S. President Donald Trump last month raised U.S. tariffs on China to a combined 145%, and China retaliated by hitting American imports with a 125% levy. This led to the countries boycotting each other's products, disrupting trade that last year topped $660 billion. During Trump's first term, the U.S. alleged that China uses unfair tactics to give itself an edge in advanced technologies such as quantum computing and driverless cars. These include forcing U.S. and other foreign companies to hand over trade secrets in exchange for access to the Chinese market, using government money to subsidize domestic tech firms, and outright theft of sensitive technologies. Those issues were never fully resolved. After nearly 2 years of negotiation, the United States and China reached a so-called Phase 1 agreement in January 2020. The U.S. agreed then not to go ahead with even higher tariffs on China, and Beijing agreed to buy more American products. The tough issues, like China's subsidies, were left for future negotiations. But China didn't come through with the promised purchases, partly because COVID-19 disrupted global commerce just after the Phase 1 truce was announced. Trump is also agitated by America's massive trade deficit with China, which came to $263 billion last year.
All right, let's do it. We're going to take a look at global news here, and then also I want to play the LBC news about this subject matter. Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Get the turmeric. This will soak up free radicals because it's an antioxidant. It's also going to bring down inflammation. By bringing down inflammation, you're helping your cardiovascular health and your immune system. Ashwagandha root helps to control cortisol levels and your blood glucose levels. That's very important for your cardiovascular health and bringing down inflammation. By bringing down inflammation, you're helping with your immune system. A lot of people don't realize that if you have chronic elevated cortisol levels, that's immunosuppressive. So if you bring those down, your immune system will start to boost. So please go to my store, get the ashwagandha root, stack it with the turmeric. It works really well for cardiovascular health and for your immune system. All right, let's do global news first.
They laughed at me when I used the pink salt trick, but after I dropped 6 pant sizes using just that, they went silent.
American and Chinese officials are meeting in Switzerland today to de-escalate the ongoing trade war between the two countries. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Trade Representative Jamieson Greer are holding talks with the Chinese delegation. Prospects for a breakthrough appear dim, but there is hope that the two countries will scale back massive tariffs they've slapped on each other's goods. The dispute threatens to cut off.
I'm going to go to live now here. They're talking about the Switzerland negotiations.
In the States. And so there's a strong incentive for both sides to work out an agreement that resumes the natural exchange and interlocking of the people within the two countries, because as we can see by the sales figures, it's been very beneficial to both sides. Americans are prosperous, hence they vacuum up a lot of the world's production. The Chinese are increasingly prosperous, which means they vacuum up a lot of production, including a lot of American production. If we're not trading with one another, we're both worse off as countries.
Obviously, a lot of questions about all of this, as a lot of it is being done secretly here. We got some video of it earlier of the cars that were leaving, but yeah, not a lot of information coming out just yet. Could a partial tariff rollback be maybe a strategic move by the U.S. to gain concessions from China on some of the other issues there, like technology transfers, market access, all of that?
Oh, absolutely. I hope the goal is, let's never forget that Scott Bessent has a history as an economics historian in addition to an investor. And so I think he recognizes the old saying that when goods don't cross borders, armies do. The beauty of trade is that it gives countries a rooting interest in the health of one another, mainly because you don't want to shoot at your best customers. And so I think the goal here is that, but there's also a recognition that unless they come to a concrete agreement, that unless they can report good progress, that's going to reflect in cascading stock markets going downwards on Monday, which is something Americans don't want, that the Chinese don't want. Let's never forget that most Americans have a stake in equities, and because they do, they have a stake in open trade between the U.S. and China.
One thing we're talking about are two world powers there. We're talking about the U.S. and China. So how does all of this kind of impact the global supply chain, the global supply market as a whole?
It's profound. Let's never forget the old saying about a pencil. A pencil is an effect of intense and wildly sophisticated global cooperation. Extrapolate that to a typical Boeing airplane. That is an effect of 6-7 million different parts produced around the world. So if the Chinese and the Americans aren't cooperating in the production of all sorts of finished goods, the impact is felt globally. In fact, it's a global earthquake, because so much of what the Chinese and Americans produce is a function of production that takes place all over the world. We see the iPhone. What we don't see is that the iPhone is a collection of work and product and inputs from all over the world, roughly 6 different continents.
What about the fact that this is all taking place in Switzerland? What kind of role is Switzerland playing as it does kind of bring this dialogue, bring those U.S. and Chinese officials together? And why is it kind of acting, I guess, as maybe the mediator?
Well, it's a really interesting question, and my speculation is that precisely because Switzerland has historically been seen as the neutral party in global disagreements, that this is a way of saying we're not going to have a home team or an away team, These are two prominent countries. These two countries are economically the future of the world. No one's doubting that. And so let's have these important discussions at a place where no one's a winner or a loser, where basically we can recognize that trade involves winners precisely because it's the mutual enhancing of both sides. We exchange with others because it makes us better. Let's make sure that we're having these discussions on neutral territory.
And taking a live look over the White House, when you talk about the U.S. and China, what sectors in both countries here tend to gain, lose the most from the potential outcomes of whatever happens here during these negotiations?
Well, it's pretty broad because let's never forget, again, maybe to visit China is to see that McDonald's are everywhere. It's to see GM cars. But it's also to see high-end products like Apple. It's to see Nike stores everywhere. And so it's very broad precisely because the Chinese, never forget, were desperately poor for the longest time. They want everything that we have. Americans also are enormously productive. They want the world's produce. And so there's not one thing. It's many things. And what's important is that them working together means that there's a lot more production of all sorts of the things that people want. And crucially, it's production that occurs at lower and lower prices. When you think of something like an iPhone, if they had tried to make the ones that we have today 20 years ago, they would cost millions and millions of dollars. Why can we buy them for $700? We can because they are an effect of global cooperation of producers around the world. And so it's very necessary to make sure that we're working together, because if we're not, most of what's produced in the world we couldn't get, and we certainly couldn't get affordably.
John, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and break it all down for folks watching, myself included here. Anything else you want to add before I let you go?
And what I'd like to add is once again that there are winners and the only losers in it when we put up barriers to each other are everyone. Think about if you tried to cut your own hair, if you had to make your own clothing, if you had to build the house you live in. I know in my case, I would die a very quick death, born of no shelter, of no food, and really awful clothing. People working together is the path to plenty. And recognize that an economy is about individuals. And if we're working together, we individuals get a lot more, all while getting to do the work.
Well, in a perfect environment, perfect world, that makes sense. No, in a perfect world. What happens when your economic clustering is shipped overseas and the people that are coming out of college or high school can't find the entry-level jobs to be able to grow their career and create families? And so they're burdened with debt from their education, and they cannot climb the ladder and build the skill sets they need throughout their adulthood life. That's a big problem. What happens when you outsource your economic clustering and you no longer can build the war machines, such as naval vessels, to be able to project power in the Pacific? We have that problem right now. So he's wrong, absolutely wrong. This is the problem with these economists and the globalists. They're viewing things in a perfect setting where, there'll be some sort of national equilibrium. But because we're dealing with human beings, it doesn't work. You got to protect some industries. So while they're on break, please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Please get the magnesium and zinc. This will boost up your immune system. And magnesium is very important for your brain health. You should be taking magnesium every day. And magnesium also increases the efficacy of vitamin D3. So take magnesium and zinc, boost up your immune system and your brain health. Vitamin C and magnesium boost up your immune system and your brain health, but it also helps with your skin. So please go to my store, get the vitamin C and magnesium. You can take them separately, or you can take them together, stack them together, drink it with filtered water. Really important to take every day. Get the vitamin C and magnesium, or the magnesium and zinc. So, the problem with these economists or even politicians, they're pushing globalization. They never really do the deep dive in what's the empirical evidence of what is happening when you outsource your economic cluster, especially when you look at it over a multiple decade situation. All right. You outsource, you're bringing in goods. Yes, foreign companies and foreign nations are buying the debt that we issue in the bond market. So we have a capital account surplus, but a trade deficit. But is the society really better off? And when you do the deep dive, the answer is no. All right. Now they're talking about the. All right. I want to go to LBC here.
Mr. Singham, thanks very much indeed for being on the programme. Can I ask you whether you think the UK government should trust in the Americans to uphold this economic prosperity deal? I was looking at the text of it. It seems that either side can walk away from it at any point without giving the other side any notice.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think in terms of what the economic prosperity deal actually says, I think the way to look at it is it's essentially in two parts. I mean, one part is some what you might call down payments, so things that the US and the UK have agreed in exchange for a reduction of the immediate pay, which is the 25% tariff on steel and aluminium and the effectively 27.5% tariff on cars. So you've got the 100,000 car quota for the UK down to 10% tariff. We sold about 102,000 cars in the US last year, so it's around that kind of level. And a commitment also to steel and aluminium tariffs going down to zero, provided that the production of those steel and aluminium, that steel and aluminium does not have China origin material in it. So there's some other things, on beef, access both ways, increasing the amount of beef and that type of thing. But more importantly, I think it's a commitment to actually stop the negotiation. So, the second part of it, beyond the down payment, is a commitment to negotiate on things that have been long-standing irritants between the US and the UK, the EU when we were in the EU. And those are things related to regulations, technical barriers to trade, standard setting and that type of thing. So I don't think you can really judge this until the rest of that negotiation has actually happened. My view of this is it's a good start. It certainly solves the immediate pain that the UK economy was under as a result of this. But you'll have to wait until the rest of the negotiation unfolds in order to sort of judge it, properly on what it's able to achieve.
But Shankar, given that there is so much still to be negotiated, why the headlong rush to unveil this agreement last week?
Yeah, no, it's obviously the way the Trump administration is doing things is very unusual and is not the normal way that trade negotiations are concluded. I mean, this whole idea of a sort of down payment where these things are agreed in order to remove some of the tariffs is really without precedent. But I think from a UK perspective, the most immediate thing was to stop the bleeding. And the bleeding was being caused by the high tariff on cars and steel and aluminium. I think they've achieved that, at least. But, we still have a 10% tariff on other products. And that is a big hit to the UK economy. And I think the president has said that he's willing to negotiate even that 10%. But I think it will have to be a very good deal in order to make progress on that element.
But actually, the White House yesterday insisted there would be no negotiation on that 10% tariff. It is there to stay, according to the White House press secretary, who said she had just checked that out with the president personally.
Yeah, the president has said that he's willing to negotiate on the 10%. I think it's going to be very difficult to get that 10% moved, but I think with the right kind of deal, it is possible. Now, obviously, if the US comes to the UK and says, there's a 10% tariff, we want all these things from you, and we're not prepared to give you any break at all on the 10% tariff, that's not very much of an incentive to negotiate much of anything. So I suspect that that won't hold. But I also fully suspect that it would have to be a very, very big deal, very, very good deal for that 10% to go down. But I think it probably will.
Can I ask you also about the talks that are taking place this weekend between the Americans and Chinese officials over the whopping tariffs and the back and forth tit-for-tat trade war that exists between those two countries? Donald Trump, I think overnight, was musing that maybe 80% tariffs would be apposite for China. I mean, do you see any solution in sight? Anything coming out of this weekend's talks that tangibly is going to begin the process of resolving that standoff?
I don't expect there will be much out of this weekend, but I equally I think it's quite important that they are at least talking and that there at least is a channel that is open. I think from a US perspective, what they'll want to do is, now they've started the process of these economic prosperity deals, and a core part of these economic prosperity deals is what is your partner's approach to China's distortions. I mean, the administration is very, very focused on removing market distortions that damage competition, and China is obviously a big proponent of that. So what they'll want to do is they'll want to lock in a few other countries. So I think Japan, Korea, India, possibly Vietnam, Australia. These are the kinds of countries they'll want to advance significantly with, and then you have some allies in order to sort of confront China distortions. I think the Chinese already are experiencing, I think even before this happened, the Chinese were already starting to perhaps question their economic model, because the Chinese economy was not doing especially well. And obviously with this tariff, the overproduction in China caused by the distortions is having to be absorbed by domestic consumption, and you're seeing quite a lot of deflationary pressure in China now. So there's some pain there. And they have to be careful about trying to ship that excess consumption or excess production to other countries, because there could be a safeguarding duty, for example, in the European Union or the UK or other countries, if there's a flood of cheap China products into those countries. So I think what you'll probably see is a fairly long process led by these other group of like-minded countries to try to then bring China more into the realm of reducing its distortions and reducing the effects of overproduction in a number of different sectors.
But that lengthy process, of course, certainly means the possibility of a supply chain crisis in America.
Yeah, no, I mean, there is no doubt a big effect of all of these. Any massive dislocation, massive realignment like this is obviously going to cause significant supply chain disruptions, supply chain problems, and that is, I think that is inevitable. I think the administration's view, if you talk to Jameson Greer, for example, the US trade rep, I mean, their view would be, look, we've spent 30 years trying to reduce these distortions. Look at the book the president waved around, the National Trade Estimate. You've had no progress on any of these issues. We can continue doing what we've been doing and nothing will change. We can have this major realignment, but clearly it will come with a cost. And the question for the administration is, how long can they survive, on this kind of policy approach, with major disruption going on in the world, with the effect this will have on markets, and that will be the thing that may weaken the president's negotiating hand.
Absolutely, could be a lean Christmas. Shankar Singham, thank you very much indeed.
All right, we're going to pivot over to another episode of LBC. But please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Help support the work that I do by purchasing the products. These are products that I take every day to slow down the aging process, to boost up that immune system, help with the endocrine system, and improve your longevity. Good Night Formula is a supplement that you should be taking every night. It'll help you to sleep. You need 3 cycles of REM sleep and deep sleep to be able to detoxify your central nervous system, to be well rested in the morning, and to consolidate memory. If you are sleep deprived chronically, you have a higher chance of getting early onset of dementia, and your memory will start to fade. Your consolidation of memory starts to fade. So it's very important to get a good sleep. Not too much sleep, but being sleep deprived is terrible for the brain. And you will age faster. Cortisols, your cortisol levels will be elevated throughout the day. And with elevated cortisol levels versus someone that gets enough sleep, you're actually, if you have high cortisol levels chronically, that's immunosuppressive. So that means your immune system is down. So you need a good sleep. So make sure you go to my store, get the Good Night formula. It has tryptophan, melatonin, GABA, and passion flower. Now, when you get older, once you turn about age 40, you need to start taking care of your pancreas. I don't care how healthy you are, everyone's pancreas starts to decline when you get older. So taking digestive enzyme complex will help you to break up carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids so that you'll be able to digest your food, to be able to absorb those nutrients easier, and put less stress on your pancreas. Very important. If you work out, if you're an athlete, either younger or older, taking digestive enzyme complex is going to help you break up your pre or your post fueling after your workout. So please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Take the digestive enzyme complex, really important. And a great stack would be help with your detoxifying of your brain, consolidation of memory, getting good rest by taking the Good Night formula, and then stack it with the digestive enzyme complex, and you're dealing with your pancreatic health and helping with your digestion. It's a great stack. So please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Use discount 5 and you get $5 off any order.
US trade talks starting as we speak in Switzerland today. Is this a sign that Trump is thawing on his China trade war? It may be. Let's see where these talks go. I mean, I think it's important to underscore, Matt, that for the last 3 weeks, the President of the United States has falsely claimed that direct talks were underway between the United States and China in an effort to alleviate the tariff burden. We now know that was flatly untrue. And the reason we know it is because his Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, testifying on Capitol Hill under oath last week, finally told the truth and said actually there'd been no communication whatsoever. So that then led to a flurry of activity behind the scenes where the Trump administration had basically been saying to the Chinese, we'd love to talk, but for it to happen, President Xi has to ask us to engage in talks. And President Xi, not being that kind of a leader, said, I'm not going to ask them anything, I'll just wait. So finally, these talks have now been created and are taking place. Donald Trump mused yesterday about the possibility of reducing American tariffs on China to 80%. There's a whole range, but you can assume that they're roughly an average of about 145% at the moment, with some tariffs on some goods even higher than that. But for the Americans and for the Chinese, the clock here is really ticking. And the Chinese know that the real consequences of Donald Trump's trade war are only about to bite, because containers are not moving. The flurry of activity before the tariffs were implemented to get goods in from China has already taken place. So now there's nothing coming into the United States. The director of the Port of Los Angeles was saying last week that he thinks 20% of dockers and cargo drivers may have their employment at stake, on the line in the Greater Los Angeles area, because there is so little traffic moving, so few containers arriving. So Donald Trump is going to find himself under increased pressure in the weeks ahead because prices in America are going to soar and there will be supply chain shortages on the shelves. So the Chinese think he's now ready to make a deal. 80%? Is that an acceptable level of tariff? Is that a deal?
I mean, it's a hell of a lot. Yeah. There was also, when I was in the States, which was, I think, astonishing just a few days ago, there was what I would like to call Barbiegate, when Trump suggested that actually kids girls don't need $30 for Christmas. They can do with $2 for Christmas. It maybe cost a little bit more. Now, I couldn't possibly comment, right? But Trump is not the kind of guy who normally
talks, a low Barbie game. He wants lots of gold in his life.
There's a direct contradiction, right? I've introduced a new golden age to the United States. It's Liberation Day with these tariffs, but actually you've got to tell the kids they can only have $2 instead of 30. And it's been compounded this week by his own Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, who found himself on Fox News earlier in the week, asked by even a Fox News primetime host, how are you going to explain this to the kids? And he said that the answer to that question is you have to sit the children down and you have to tell them that thanks to Donald Trump, their lives and the lives of their families are eventually going to be great.
Right.
Just not yet.
Yes. I mean, and the key word is eventually, isn't it? Because with all these, even if the tariff policies of Liberation Day were to work, bringing back jobs to the Rust Belt, which frankly I think is incredibly doubtful given AI, given robotics and automation. If you're going to lose money on trade with China, you're going to make money at home by not employing more workers. That seems obvious to me. But even if that were to work in the interim, which could take years, he's got a problem with empty shelves. So is that what we're seeing? The overall picture, having fired on all fronts on Liberation Day on the 2nd of April, are we seeing in a rather messy way Donald J. Trump in retreat?
Well, I think we are seeing him in retreat partially, but not in sufficient retreat that he's walking away from the whole idea of tariffs. Indeed, if you look at what the White House said yesterday about the trade deal with the UK, they really doubled down, insisting that the 10% baseline tariff that remains in force against pretty much everything that isn't steel, aluminium, or 100,000 British-made cars, that is going to be in place for perpetuity. There is no plan on the part of the Trump administration ever to offer anything less than a 10% baseline tariff. So, if he says to the Chinese, 80% for you, the Chinese, having witnessed the UK negotiation, as every other country has now done, will say to themselves, well, we don't want to be stuck with this 80% tariff for the rest of time, so maybe we'll play hardball and just dig in our heels and wait for the consequences of all of this to build up in the United States.
On India-Pakistan, Trump said just a few days ago he wants to see a ceasefire. J.D. Vance then suddenly said, actually, we're not going to get involved in that one, maybe because it's too complicated.
The problem with his logic with that is he's assuming that the United States is going to give in first. The Chinese economy is really suffering, and it's been suffering even before the tariffs. So the runway is much shorter for President Xi than President Trump. That President Trump's economy can absorb the shock far more for multiple reasons. One, we have a healthier economy than the Chinese. Two, we also have a better transmission mechanism between our central bank and our fiscal stimulus transmission that can help bring demand if demand starts to destroy. So the Federal Reserve can pump money into our market, and because of our consumer behavior and that transmission mechanism, it's much better than what's happening in China. If China's transmission mechanism was really working, then why doesn't their central bank why isn't it translating into higher domestic consumption? Their economy is faltering right now. The Chinese economy is faltering. So they don't have as much time to wait to see. Now, will the economy in the United States over time, if this continues to escalate, and continue to have no resolution on the trade war with China, will our economy start to falter? And yes, probably some demand destruction will take place. Some goods will go up in price because of lack of availability and because of the tariffs. But then there's a feedback loop where there's a demand destruction, and then there's less buying, and therefore the prices may actually go down. But the thing is that the shock can be absorbed in the United States far greater than what's happening in China, because the starting point before the trade war happened the Chinese economy was faltering, while the United States economy was not. In addition, the Chinese economy depends on the United States to buying their goods. When the United States stops buying their goods, who hurts more? The makers. Those makers are in China, not in the United States. So I don't think the Chinese have a runway to wait. I think and then the infighting within the CCP because of the power struggle that's happening. And he didn't mention this. So I think Trump has more cards to play and has more time to wait it out than the Chinese.
The reason why a war was averted.
Your workflow is important to us. Please wait indefinitely.
With Monday.com's intuitive work management platform, you have the power, not
why a war was averted, a full-scale war was averted in 2019 is because they did get involved. America does get involved. It hasn't really got a choice about whether to get involved or not. What's going to happen is, well, Marco Rubio tried to engage in some outreach to the Indian and Pakistani leadership last night, and there were some talks between him and his opposite numbers there. Look, I think there is a reality here. There has never been an American government less ready, less qualified, and less equipped with staff,
or even less interested,
or interest to deal with the complexities of the Kashmir crisis. You've been there, I've reported from there. This is an intractable conflict that has been going on for decades, and it requires specialist knowledge and a commitment to new.
No one has said this on the internet. No one, I'm sure of it. The tech, and it just dawned on me. Trump's tweet about the 80% tariff, right? From 145% on China's goods to 80% potentially, but it's up to Scott B, all right, when he did that post on Truth. And even here, Chinese levies may be half to 80%. 80% is code. Trump, I'm telling you, Trump is a fucking genius. VE Day is 80 years. It's been 80 years since VE Day. Victory in Europe. All right. Trump just shot over the bow of the Chinese about hinting that we will be victorious with this trade war. This is not the 80% is not the tariff. The 80% is the number of years since VE Day.
Diplomacy and statecraft, even if you're simply going to talk these two countries down from the ledge. And this Trump administration has absolutely no one in place capable of doing that. Not a single person.
Even though President Trump says that he gets on famously with Narendra Modi, his most glorious foreign visit when he was president the first time was the one to India, where he went to the Modi Stadium outside Delhi, I think it was the biggest stadium in India, and he got this incredible rapturous welcome. I mean, the two guys see eye to eye, lots of issues.
Right. Does anybody honestly think Donald Trump could find Kashmir on a map? This is a president of the United States who can't pick up the phone and call the American ambassador to India for advice because there isn't one. He can't pick up the phone and call the American ambassador to Pakistan for advice because there isn't one. So, I mean, and look at the State Department, the National Security Council hollowed out, Marco Rubio now running both of them, Secretary of State and his National Security Advisor in his spare time. They haven't got the bandwidth and they haven't got the expertise and the capacity to take this on. And that should worry all of us because traditionally, as you say, the Americans would be the natural power to go in there and try and talk both of them off the ledge.
I wonder if Steve Woodcock has been given a call to say, by the way, forget about forget about Ukraine, forget about Iran. Maybe you should, do a bit of a dogleg to Delhi or to Islamabad. Finally, domestically, the war between the Trump administration and the judiciary has been up to notch.
Yeah, absolutely. Massive story this yesterday. Stephen Miller, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, said that President Trump is looking at the possibility of suspending habeas corpus, which is the writ that lies at the heart of every democracy's judicial system. It's the bit that says lawyers can go into court and say, you've detained someone illegally, you need to release them to us.
Why are they saying that?
And they're saying it because they argue that judges are preventing Donald Trump from engaging in mass deportations, although to be fair, Donald Trump has engaged in mass deportations in flagrant violation of court orders. And unless the judiciary stops trying to cut him off at the pass, they are going to suspend habeas corpus so that there will be no constitutional protections at all for these deportees. It's a huge upping of the ante by the White House in the war against the judiciary, and also parenthetically in the war against Congress, because ultimately, of course, it would be Congress that would have to decide if this core principle of American jurisprudence was simply going to be eviscerated.
Finally and briefly, Sam, this will end up in the Supreme Court, right?
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court has ruled against him in the past. They're going to do so again on this.
Yeah, well, maybe they will. I mean, presumably they will. But, you know, the ultimate question, as we've talked about on the program before, that we're going to learn the answer to in the next months, is whether Donald Trump is willing to respect US Supreme Court decisions and opinions.
In a court that he, where he appointed the majority, or is he?
It's amazing listening to Brits telling everyone in America how to think. Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the Clarity Factor. Clarity Factor will remove brain fog. It will help to consolidate memory. It supports memory. It also allows for your neurons to be firing, so you're improving that neuroplasticity and that those dendritic connections, very important. That will help you to speed your thinking. That will allow you to have better memory and allow you to concentrate at work, in school, or even if you're retired on the tasks at hand. Really important to take Clarity Factor every day, no matter what age you are. And resveratrol. Resveratrol is something that supplement that I've been taking for decades. It helps with youthful gene expression. It soaks up free radicals because it's an antioxidant. And by reducing stress in the cell and soaking up those free radicals, you're going to improve the health of your mitochondria and boost up your energy levels. Resveratrol is very important also to get rid of senescent cells. So take resveratrol every day. It stacks really well with C60, NAD+, and ubiquinol, and Clarity Factor. So if you want to help with your brain health and also help with slowing down the aging process in other tissues, take the resveratrol and stack it with the Clarity Factor and supercharge that neural health. Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Use discount 5 and you get $5 off any order. Click the link in the description of this video and all my videos to get to my website. It's the-studio-reykjavik.com. All right. I want to let's listen to Times Radio here.
They laughed at me when I used the pink salt trick, but after I dropped 6 pant sizes using just that, they went silent.
If American importers have to pay 80% tariffs and China presumably imposes 80% tariffs on American goods in exchange, that's a real blow to this incredible trading relationship, which, on which we rely, which America relies for its cheap iPhones, cheap electronics, many other cheap goods. Do you want that trade to come to an end? What will happen to the prices of these goods if they can't be made in China? How long would it take for other markets to open up, to build your iPhone factories in India or Vietnam itself? Or do you just, you build them in America using American workers, in which case they'll of course be much more expensive because American labor is much more expensive than Vietnamese or Chinese labor.
Now let's speak to Richard Spencer, who's the Times China correspondent. Morning, Richard.
Good morning.
Good to speak to you. I suppose the starting point of these trade talks is where we'll begin as well, because the steep tariffs on China imposed by the US. Fresh data this weekend shows that China's overall exports have actually grown sharply for April. Does that mean that China's going into this actually from the position of strength?
No.
Yeah, I think they are actually, and I think not just because of these trade statistics, but just because of what you heard, which is that.
Let me get this straight. You have less goods coming over the boat, landing on the shores of the United States. But before the trade war started, China's economy was tanking. The United States economy was surging. President Xi is having infighting in the CCP. And China's people, the people within China, are having social disruption with the banking industry within China. Now, you really think that President Xi is on a stronger footing with negotiations under those circumstances? Get real. Get real. The United States has way more time to play this out than China does.
Is basically saying, oh, tariffs, they're not what it's all about. We're actually trying to we're trying to sort of talk about other things, which is a sort of backtrack, right? And China's saying, okay, well, that's what we said all along. We're always happy to have a conversation with you, as long as you're not trying to sort of punish us with these massive 145% tariffs. And Trump's already saying, well, we're going to reduce them. In which case China sort of says, well, you're on our territory. We're always open to talks. You tell us what you want, and we'll go away and think about them. It hands China a position of moral strength. Now that the export figures, I mean, you can't go too much on 1 month because, of course, China saw these tariffs coming. Trump had signaled them, so was preparing, and of course the exporters were particularly, and they were preparing for this. They were preparing new markets in Southeast Asia, for example, for all the products that would no longer be able to be sold to America. But those countries in Southeast Asia are now sort of saying, well, actually, we don't want all these cheap imports either. So they're going to start preparing to hit back. So it's still a big problem for China, these tariffs. In the long term, it's not good for its export market to have, one of its biggest markets shut off to it. America is about 13% of its export market. That's not
China's economy is in the doldrums. By cutting off the American market to China, it's going to put serious pressure on their economy that's already stressed. And there's political stress, President Xi, and no one's talking about that. No one is paying attention to the political infighting that is happening within the CCP. But these experts know better.
It's not a massive figure, but it's quite significant for Chinese companies.
In terms of who will be meeting in Geneva, just tell us about the Chinese delegation specifically. I'm quite intrigued by Vice Premier He Lifeng, who is a friend of Xi, I think is fair to say.
This is what Ivy League universities you can get into with a 3.6 GPA.
90% of students with a 4.0 plus GPA.
Of Xi, I think is fair to say.
Yeah, I mean, He Lifeng, to give him his, it was a confusing surname in Chinese, but it's pronounced He. Is the chief economic guy in the regime, if you like, in the top levels. He's the vice premier in charge of economics and finance, which is the most important of those four vice premiers that they have. So he's outside the absolute top ranks of the Chinese Communist Party, but he's in the sort of next tier down, if you like. Yes, those positions, those key positions in that sort of second tier are very much handpicked by Xi Jinping himself. So yeah, he has the confidence and the experience to handle this. The question really is whether Scott Bessent, how much he has the full confidence of Trump. He's the most sort of realist, the most normal, you might say, of Trump's advisors. He's the one who wants deals, who wants the most standard and normal approach to trade relations of Trump's advisors. So he's been given this power to do a deal. We just have to trust that that what he said will be accepted by Trump, because that's much less clear in the American system as it currently is than in the Chinese system.
In terms of Trump's approach then, and the Trump administration's approach, he's already been posting on Truth Social as his wont. Tariffs currently at 145%, but he suggests 80% might be about where they get to. What do you make of that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, to go back to first principles, a lot of people, including Democrats in America and a lot of economists in China as well as in America, agree that the trade relationship between China and America is unbalanced. These massive trade surpluses that China has with many countries, but particularly with America, and particularly the way that it achieves this by recycling the profits into holdings of dollar and other foreign currency reserves, which adds security to the Chinese economic system, but effectively forces America to live in a state of constant debt, is a danger and destabilizing. So there is an argument, a very strong argument, that some kind of tariffs and controls on this trade, as opposed to the sort of the purest American traditional view of sort of open markets, free financial flows, and so on, is necessary to restabilize the economy, and tariffs might be part of that. The trouble with these headline figures is that they come over as threats rather than as negotiations. 80% is still a huge tariff, and if American importers have to pay 80% tariffs, and China presumably imposes 80% tariffs on American goods in exchange, that's a real.
Well, the problem is the Chinese started this. They steal the IP. They force companies to partner up with China firms when you're doing production in China, and they have barriers of entry into their markets with American goods. They have tariffs on America. This is the issue that people don't get the point. The Chinese have tariffs on American goods before the tariff war.
Blow to this incredible trading relationship, on which we rely, which America relies for its cheap iPhones, cheap electronics, many other cheap goods. Do you want that trade to come to an end?
Do you think $1,000 phone? Do you think your phone, the $1,000 phone, is cheap? This is not cheap. And the margin that Apple has is very high. Apple can absorb a little bit of the tariff. I'm sure of it.
What will happen to the prices of these goods if they can't be made in China? How long would it take for other markets to open up, to build your iPhone factories in India or Vietnam itself? Or do you just you build them in America using American workers, in which case they'll of course be much more expensive, because American labor is much more expensive than Vietnamese or Chinese labor. I mean, these are huge questions which aren't really answered by any particular tariff figure that Trump decides to come up with.
Richard, really good to speak to you. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us. Richard Spencer there, who is the Times China correspondent.
What parameters have you given Scott Bessent on negotiating with China this weekend?
We have to make a great deal for America.
Are you going to be disappointed if he comes back without a deal?
No, not at all. We already made a great deal. We're not doing business with China right now.
Meet the tiniest HR team in the world. What do you think Paylocity does?
Paylocity.
I never heard that before.
All right, so what we're gonna go over what Bloomberg posted about empty shelves. But before we do that, please go to my store, the-Reykjavik.com, and get these great supplements that I offer. Try this stack that I'm going to mention. Omega-3 helps to prevent red blood cells from sticking or over sticking. So that's going to help you to control clotting. All right. That's very important. Omega-3 also brings down systemic inflammation. That's important for your cardiovascular health and your immune system. And omega-3 helps to bring down LDL levels and helps to increase your HDL levels. So your total cholesterol is better. Your total cholesterol profile will be better. And that means that you're reducing LDL oxidation, which means less plaque buildup. So very important for your cardiovascular health. Another great supplement to take for your cardiovascular health is nattokinase. Breaks up clots because it's fibrinolytic, and it helps to bring down LDL levels and increase your HDL levels. Like I said, when you control your lipid profile, you're reducing the chances of oxidized LDL and plaque buildup. So you're reducing that plaque buildup. That helps your cardiovascular health. Stacking these together is a very powerful stack, nattokinase with omega-3. Another great stack that you can add to the omega-3 and nattokinase, or just take separately, it's up to you, is multivitamin. This multivitamin is easy to digest, and it has the multivitamins that you need as cofactors for enzymatic activity. That will help with cellular metabolism, cellular processes, and when you have a good foundation with a multivitamin, you can build off of that and build this anti-aging longevity protocol for yourself and help your bodily systems work. But having a multivitamin is a very important foundation, very important for your enzymatic activity, because this has the cofactors for your enzymes so they work properly. And another great foundation to take is a probiotic. I have two types. This one is a veggie cap. I also have a powdered version. But taking a probiotic is very important to have the right gut biome that will bring down inflammation at the gut level. That'll allow you to absorb your nutrients. That will also help with your immune system at the gut level and help with the communication between your gut and your liver and your gut and your brain. Very important. So take a probiotic every day. Like I said, I have this veggie cap version and I have a powdered version. Stacking it with a multivitamin is a great foundation to build off of. And you stack these together, you're helping with your gut health, you're helping with your cellular metabolism and having the cofactors that you need for enzymatic activity, and you're helping with your cardiovascular health with the omega-3 and the nattokinase. It's a great stack. So please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Use discount 5, you get $5 off any order. Click the link in the description box to get to my website, the-studio-reykjavik.com.
This is just an observation, namely that if you look at the weekly data for consensus earnings expectations, they have come down quite significantly, both for Q2 and Q3 for the S&P 500. Right. So the first thing that has happened is a downward revision to earnings. The second thing that has happened is that we normally have a very tight correlation between interest rates and the dollar. And that correlation actually also broke down after the Liberation Day. So now the dollar is trading not so much on interest rates, but on other factors.
Yeah, and Pacific Rim dynamics, we'll get into that later in the show, folks. Some of those currencies continue painful. This morning, Yahtzee at Goldman Sachs publishes out on an inventory dynamic of 2% plus Q2 GDP. Do you see like normal growth for this second quarter?
What is very unusual about the second quarter is that we're coming from a place where we had significant front loading of purchases among consumers, and we had significant inventory build among corporates, simply because people were preparing for April the 2nd, which happens to be the second day in the second quarter, namely when tariff, of course, began to kick in. So the conclusion is there are some fairly significant bumps when it comes especially to the inventory part of GDP and to the import part of GDP in the first and the second quarter.
On the consumer confidence basis, we're seeing consumer confidence get hit as a result of tariff policy. Still, though, in the hard data, we're not necessarily seeing it hit there. When do we see it hit?
So Barclays yesterday had a very important note that looked at, just like several others, at the high frequency data. And what they are seeing in the daily data is that we're beginning to see a slowdown for high-end consumers, especially when it comes to airline bookings, hotel reservation, recreational travel more broadly, and also higher-end durable goods. So one way of looking at this is that you should ultimately expect to see, especially those that are now impacted by the stock market correcting, you should begin to see them begin to slow down their consumer spending. And that is exactly what the data is beginning to show. So yes, it is still early in terms of when tariffs were implemented. We're still only a few weeks in, but the longer this shock persists, the higher is the risk, of course, that this is going to drag down also hard data.
What is the risk there? I mean, contextualize this for us, because the president, yesterday we heard from Bill Ackman, who said, okay, I want to see a 180-day pause. Now, I want to see this 90-day pause extended to 180 days. At what point in your view do you see the damage from these policies actually becoming something that's entrenched rather than temporary?
Well, and that's a very important question, Tim, because what I think is going on is that companies are actually already responding to tariffs. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the surveys from the regional feds, they are showing the new orders is collapsing. Excuse me, they're showing that CapEx plans are collapsing, and they're showing that prices paid are going up. This is the definition of stagflation. That means that there's going to be slower sales, there's going to be more increase in prices, and this is happening on the corporate side. Consumers have not quite yet seen this, but it's coming, especially with the significant slowdown in the number of containers coming from China to the US. That means that the inventory will, in the next few weeks, in my view, we will begin to see empty shelves. I don't even know how we're having this discussion. Of course, if we get normally 30,000 containers from China coming in, and we no longer get 30,000 containers from China coming in, of course we'll begin to see empty shelves installed.
As Tim mentioned, Senator Paul Sweeney today, Tim mentioned there's a rationalization going on among elites over tariff theory. You and I read Ricardo's cover to cover. There's no rationalization. Either tariff theory of a pseudo McKinley doesn't work, or you believe it's going to work. There's no in between, right?
And that's why, and in some sense, you could think exactly of this as in the model that you and I would have talked about for years, Tom, that if this shock is temporary and if it lasts a week, we would all say, okay, this was a week, now we go back to normal.
Right.
But given this shock is 145%, and so far it feels quite permanent, we would say, well, it's permanent, you got to adjust to a new equilibrium. And that new equilibrium, it will have the consequence that prices are higher and sales are lower.
But it's a shift. Can I go nerd right now?
Please go nerd.
For Paul Krugman, one walk right now. There's a deadweight loss in the Euclidean calculus.
Exactly.
There's a shift. Who allocates the deadweight loss? Policy or brute economics?
Yeah. So exactly where that deadweight loss has to be allocated. The very important, simple way of thinking about that is that does that have to be allocated to firms taking a decline in their earnings, or does it have to be instead allocated to consumers basically facing higher prices? So put in very plain English, the container arrives in Los Angeles, someone needs to pay the tariff. Is that tariff now passed 100% onto consumers? Is it passed 50% onto consumers? Is it only passed 25% onto consumers? So companies will take a hit on their earnings if it's not passed on 100% to consumers. So that deadweight loss, that cost of higher tariffs has to be borne by someone. And if it is not corporates, it will ultimately be the consumer.
I mean, it seems politically, companies don't want to be public about increasing prices as a result of these tariffs. So would you argue that at this point, it looks like
why did it stop?
Component. In other words, what a company is saying in terms of what is the price that I'm paying for goods that are inputs in my production. And if the answer is prices paid is going up, and at the moment prices paid is skyrocketing because companies are saying I'm paying more, and if I'm paying a survey from the Fed, the prices are going up. So that's not a political discussion or political statement, it's just the fact.
Let me rewind that a little bit.
So does that have to be allocated to firms taking a decline in their earnings? Or does it have to be instead allocated to consumers basically facing higher prices? So put in very plain English, the container arrives in Los Angeles, someone needs to pay the tariff. is that tariff now passed 100% onto consumers? Is it passed 50% onto consumers? Is it only passed 25% onto consumers? So companies will take a hit on their earnings. It's not passed on 100% to consumers. So they lost. That cost of higher tariffs has to be borne by someone. And if it is not corporates, it will also need to be the consumer.
I mean, it seems politically, companies don't want to be public about increasing prices as a result of these tariffs. So would you argue that at this point, it looks like companies are going to absorb this, or they're going to try to pass it along to consumers in a way that's not necessarily prominent?
So that's why one way of answering that question is to simply look at what a company is actually doing. And for example, from the Dallas Fed, the Philadelphia Fed, the New York Fed, the Kansas City Fed, the prices paid component. In other words, what a company is saying in terms of what is the price that I'm paying for goods that are inputs in my production. And if the answer is prices paid is going up, and at the moment prices paying is skyrocketing, because companies are saying, I'm paying more. And if I'm paying more, then I'm saying in this survey from the Fed, the prices are going up. So that's not a political discussion or political statement. It's just the facts that companies are saying they're paying more. So as a result of that, we should expect, it happens to be the case when you overlay that together with the CPI inflation, that will be lifting inflation eventually.
I personally think that we don't really fully appreciate what truly will happen with the negotiations and how tariffs will translate into higher prices or even the potential lack of goods. We don't know yet, all right? Is there probably going to be some disruption in terms of supply? Yes. Will some goods be higher? Yes. But there's also going to be some demand destruction. There may be switching of certain products that you may have bought in that were Chinese, that you may switch that are made in America. But even if there isn't a substitute, maybe it's a good thing to actually spend less for like 6 months in the United States. It's not going to hurt. You know, why do we have to constantly consume? Constantly. I think when Trump said, you know, maybe some toys, instead of having 30 of them, you only have 2 of them. Well, maybe he's getting to a point that maybe we have overconsumed in the United States. But no matter who the economist is, they don't know for sure what's truly going to happen. All right. But it's probably going to be a mixed bag. Some demand destruction, some price increases in some goods, some, supply disruption, which may change consumer behavior. So it's not cookie cutter. There's gonna be a mosaic of how it propagates through the economy. With that said, thank you for listening. I greatly appreciate the ones that have been watching tonight and throughout all the transmissions that I've been doing lately. I'm going to shut this down now, but thank you for listening. Stay tuned for tomorrow. I'm going to be doing a show with John Hogue live at 10 p.m. New York time. So that's Eastern time. 10 p.m. Eastern time will be a live show with John Hogue, and we'll most likely talk about what's going on with the Pope and some other events like India and Pakistan. He spent time in India, so he probably has a unique perspective on what's going on. So thank you for listening. I greatly appreciate it. Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Get the supplements to help support the work that I do and to help support your health and wellness. It's a win-win situation. Thank you for listening and have a good night.